Good evening. You're a lot more polite than I am. My name is Carlos Frank. I'm a professor of cosmology at the University of Durham. I'm also the chair of the Royal Society's Public Engagement Committee. The Royal Society is the UK Academy of Science. So I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here to this evening's event, those of you who are here at the stage, and also those of you watching online. Now, before we get going, can I please remind you to turn your phones to silent, please? And also to let you know that there is no fire drill scheduled for tonight. So if you hear a fire alarm, then please make your way calmly to the exits, which are at the sides and at the back of the hall. Now, on to tonight's event. So this is the third installment of a series run by the Royal Society called You and the Planet, which it's taking place in various venues across the country. Now, I'm sure most of us will agree that planet Earth is a beautiful place, and this particularly so for those of us lucky enough to live in this particularly beautiful part of the planet in the northeast of England. Nevertheless, our planet, of course, faces a number of existential risks. Climate change, the evidence for which is really now pretty overwhelming. The onset of a sixth mass extinction and the associated collapse of the insect population and threats to our food security. So these are risks that threaten, at the very least, our way of life, and at the very worst, the survival of our species. Now, the goal of the I should say that all these existential threats, we tend to sometimes think about them as separate things, but they're all, of course, very closely related to one another. They're one big threat because, for example, the production of food affects the environment, which in turn affects the climate, which in turn affects all life, which in turn affects the production of food. So it's a very complex series of intertwined threats. And the goal of the You and the Planet series is to provide a scientific, and that means based on evidence, view of these existential threats, and but not in a sort of depressing and negative mood, but rather to try and look at this in a positive way, to try and inspire us to think about a future in which human activity not only protects but enhances the health of our planet. Now, tonight's theme is food. How can we feed everyone on the planet whilst minimizing our impact on the environment? And in order to discuss this very fundamental issue, we have a panel of experts from across science and business to discuss this problem. Now, the series is touring the whole of the United Kingdom, as I said, but we're particularly delighted to be here in the Northeast, which of course has a very long and proud tradition of food production, and in fact it has more sheep than anywhere else in the country. But it's also a place with a great tradition, of course, in science and engineering. Now, tonight we have a brilliant panel of experts joining us for this discussion, and thanks to the members of the audience who have supplied questions and to the panel in advance. I think these questions have really helped to shape tonight's event. If you would like to tweet during the event, please use the hashtag #YouandThePlanet. And just to thank you again for joining us this evening. And please now join me in welcoming to the stage the chair of this event, Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, who will be familiar, I'm sure, to many of you from television, and our speakers, Corina Hawkes, Juha-Pekka Pitkänen, and Gordon Conway. Hello.
Good evening, everybody. Shall I be mother? Gaia, even. There we go, that should cover it. Welcome, everybody, not just here in this fantastic theatre in this wonderful building, but also our live stream viewers who are joining us on the internet this evening. Welcome to you all, and welcome to You and the Planet, where we're going to talk about food. I'm Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall. You may know me from such television programmes as River Cottage, Britain's Fat Fight, and The War on Plastics. Or indeed you may not, but whether you do or don't, I am here tonight because I'm pretty obsessed with food. I love it to bits. It's been my life in many respects. But I also love this planet, and I find myself worrying more and more about whether the food that I eat and the choices that I make is doing damage to the planet and potentially making it, in very many senses, a less hospitable and lovable place for our children. And that's what we're going to try and get to grips with this evening. And to help me do that, I have some fantastic minds. And on my left here, I have Corinna Hawkes, who's the director of the Centre for Food Policy at City University of London. Her work supports the design and delivery of policies that improve the quality of diets locally, nationally, and internationally. She's an advisor to governments, international agencies, and NGOs, and her work is mainly concerned with providing solutions to all forms of diet-related ill health. She's currently the Vice Chair of London's Child Obesity Task Force, appointed by the Mayor of London. Welcome, Corinna. Juha-Pekka Pitkänen is the Chief Technology Officer and the co-founder of the Finnish startup company Solar Foods Limited. Solar Foods aims to bring to the market a radical new pure protein which is produced without agriculture and without any requirement for arable land. And prior to co-founding Solar Foods, Juha was a principal scientist in bioprocess engineering at VTT Technical Research Centre in Finland. Welcome, Juha. Furthest away from me, Gordon Conway is an ecologist who pioneered the sustainable management of farmland, working all around the world. He's head of the Agriculture for Impact initiative, which aims to provide sustainable livelihoods for communities in Africa. He's a professor of international development at Imperial College London. He's the former president of the Rockefeller Foundation and the Royal Geographical Society, and is a fellow of the Royal Society. Welcome, Gordon. And with such an extraordinary, illustrious introduction, I'm going to turn to Gordon first. Gordon, we're not, I think, going to do many statistics this evening, and unless any of you would like to bring them up. But it's a basic fact that world food production grew from 1.84 billion tons just back in 1961 to 4.38 billion tons in 2007. Yet people are still going hungry. And even as people starve, the way we produce food is changing fast, and it's going to start changing even faster, as I'm sure we're going to discuss tonight. As we navigate all the future possibilities of what we eat and how we produce it, what are the big challenges we're going to face?
Thank you, Hugh. I'm delighted to be here. It's great to come to Newcastle. I haven't been here for donkey's years. We have a world of crises. There's water crisis, there's an energy crisis, there's a biodiversity crisis, a food crisis, climate change crisis. And all these crises are getting worse, and they're all getting more and more interconnected. That's what we have to deal with. The reality, as Hugh said, is we've got people who are starving in the world. There's over 60 million people in South Africa at the moment who are starving, and we'll talk about that a bit later. probably the biggest threat is climate change. Just to give you one example of what's happening, is that up there are jet streams. And the point about the jet streams is that they divide the cold weather in the Arctic from the warmer weather in the tropics. And what's been happening is that the differential between the north of the jet stream and the south of the jet stream has become much less. And so the jet streams are behaving like crazy. The Guardian usually puts in pictures of the jet stream. You can look at them, and they're all behaving incredibly weirdly. And one of the consequences is extreme weather events. So we now know there's a clear line all the way from the Arctic becoming warmer to extreme events. The world is full of interconnections, and in some cases those are good because we can get food to starving people, for example. But in many cases they're also bad, in particular because of the spread of disease, and we're all worried at the moment about the coronavirus. The other thing that concerns us all is poor diets. Our diets are so poor that the health consequences are crippling our health services. And the biggest burden on the National Health Service in the United Kingdom is illness caused by poor diets. It's something that people don't really quite recognize. But how do we solve this? Well, we'll be talking more about this along the way, but in particular, we have to emphasize that everybody has a role. Not only globally, but locally. I live in a little village in Sussex. We have our own shop. We have a woman who cooks meals in the shop. The food is organic. It's sourced from the local farms. That's one way you can make a difference. So there are technical solutions and there are community solutions. And I particularly like the community solutions of working locally with small local shops. What is important in all of this is that everybody must play a role. Everybody must find what it is that they can do that really makes a difference and do it. Don't be put off by anybody. Get together and do things.
That's a very good way to set the stage for us this evening, Gordon. I actually just want to follow up on one quick point that you've made there, because you've talked about extreme weather events, and it's sort of obvious that extreme weather events will affect agriculture and they will affect food production. But are we now at a point where the converse is true, and that the way we're actually producing food is contributing to climate change, and therefore itself contributing to those extreme weather events, and therefore we're in danger of being in a pretty vicious loop? Are we in the eye of that storm?
I think that's true. It's difficult to prove it, but I think that is true. I think that the way we're farming, the way we grow crops, is in itself contributing to this whole maelstrom, if you like, of climate change. And you can see it all around you. We're doing everything wrong.
Okay, we're doing everything wrong. Let's pause on we're doing everything wrong, and we promise to come back to you very soon about doing a lot of things much better. And Corinna, I don't know whether you want to start with gloom and doom or get straight to something a bit more optimistic. But Gordon has spent much time in Africa and looking at global food supply and the problems often of undersupply and famine, but he's touched also on an issue that you're very close to, which is ill health, not caused by lack of food, but often caused by the wrong kind of food and too much food. As we navigate this curious future, so much of which is unknown to us, what we're going to be eating 10, 20, 50 years from now, do you see a different set of priorities? Does the planet have to come ahead of human health? How compatible are the solutions?
Well, I think the first thing we have to remember is that the food system is there to feed people. The reason that we have a food system that is producing food which impacts on the environment is because we need to eat. And it's a very basic and obvious thing to say, but it leads directly to an approach which is people-centred. that we must put people at the centre of this and start with people and ask ourselves, what do people need to eat for basic growth and development? And of course that means babies, it means young children. It means, are we looking after the health of our young children and enabling them to grow and develop? If we don't, the effects nutritionally are born for, have long-term impacts. So we need to look after our children, and we need to put people at the centre and ask, what are their nutritional needs? What does food need to supply to them? Whether it's enough food, whether it's enough of the right kind of food, whether it's not eating too much food. So let's put people at the centre of bringing up solutions. And that means that we need to have a world in which healthy, nutritious food is centre stage. If you go out into the streets, I haven't been to the streets around here at last. I did walk here, but I didn't pass any particular places.
So you're not going to name some big global food brands and shame them in front of the audience right now?
No, but in every city, in every place, in every part of the world, nutritious, healthy food is rarely centre stage. And it needs to be if it's going to be easy for people to eat well and to have those options. And if we're going to put healthy, nutritious food centre stage, then you need to go further back into the food supply chain, further back into the food system and say, how can our food system actually create food environments around people in which healthy, nutritious food is centre stage, and the junk food and foods we eat too much of are put aside. And that means actually rethinking the way that our food system works. The whole economy of our food system, the whole structure of our food system is designed to produce more calories and to produce them in a certain economic way to benefit certain economic actors. So we actually need to really change the fundamentals if we're going to address the economic, the social, the environmental and the health problems. So it's a big agenda. But it's a really exciting one because, like you, Hugh, I love food. I love food, and there is so many exciting things going on to change it. I mean, it's thrilling, honestly. I find it thrilling, and I think we're in a very, very exciting time because there's so many opportunities. It's such a big problem. It means there's lots of opportunities for change.
Do we have to smash food capitalism, Corinna?
Kind of. Kind of, yes.
Thought you might be hinting at that. And if we do manage to reorganise things, so instead of the cheapest calories designed in the most desirable and irresistible way, almost tweaked by science, which we'll come to very shortly, to be ridiculously moreish, if that sort of commonly known as junk food is no longer at the lead offering, and we start turning things around, I don't know, we'll talk about this later, perhaps through education, perhaps by imposing some limits and strictures on the food industry if they don't do what they ought to do. If we solve that problem, do you think we'll at the same time be solving some of the environmental issues to do with food and climate? Do the two things go together, do you think?
They're not entirely aligned, but I think if we were to restructure the system, we'd restructure it in such a way that it wasn't based on producing more and consuming more. At the moment, it's production for production's sake and consumption for consumption's sake. And that, it is overconsumption and overproduction which has that impact on the environment. So if we didn't design the system like that, the impact on the environment would necessarily be lesser.
Thank you very much, Corinna. Hugh, you're coming from a different place in the food world. And maybe you see a different set of solutions, or at least one big part of the solution lying in your world. Food tech. Is this the promised land? Has this got huge and important answers to these grim and slightly scary questions that we've raised so far this evening?
Yes, certainly. So with technology we can actually disconnect food production from kind of land requirements, or at least kind of reduce the land requirements for food production.
Let's just settle on that phrase for one moment, because I feel we're going to be coming back to it a few times this evening. We could disconnect food production from land use. Tell us a little bit more about why that's going to solve or be important in solving our problems.
Well, I mean, if we think kind of the global land area, so that we have of the kind of arable land where agriculture is possible, so already 50% of that land area is used for farming. And actually, large portion of that is used basically for feed production for animals. So very large area of arable land is already used for kind of animal feed production.
I said I wasn't going to do too many stats today, but I think it's roughly the case that in Europe, 30% of all arable land is being used to produce cereals or grains or food for animals, for meat. And in the US, it's something like 50% of all cultivated land is actually the crops, the vegetables or plants, if you like, don't go straight to us, they go to animals to make meat. Is that the heart of the problem?
Well, I would say one of the big problems, and also so that actually if you compare what's land area used for agriculture and then land area of forests, so land area of agriculture is actually bigger than forest area, so I think that's quite not a very good balance, I would say. So we actually should have more forests rather than arable land used in agriculture. So kind of using the land area more efficiently is the key thing, and there especially I would say that it comes to eating more vegetables instead of meat.
And your business is right at the heart of that disconnection, potential disconnection of land use and food production. I'm going to ask you to tell us about your product in a little bit, but just for the moment, how close do you think you and your competitors are to playing a significant role in the numbers of the problem, the scale of the problem? How many years away before you'll be able to say, because of us, land that land is, if you like, can be restored maybe to biodiversity and healthy habitats, no longer for food production because of what we're doing. More than a tiny fraction of a % of land, but significant amounts.
Yeah, of course it will take years. So for us the time scale is like 2 years we would be in kind of demonstration production, and the larger scale, let's say 5 years from now. So we are talking at the end of the century that we would really be able to make a proper impact.
So it's going to be 10 years before what you and your competitors can do in laboratories and on industrial sites without troubling the soil much.
Yeah, 5 to 10 years.
Is a significant part of our diets.
Yeah, then we could maybe start to see significant impacts.
Okay, well, we'll hear a bit more about that very soon. But what I'd also like to ask you all is, who actually is going to make the changes happen? Who should make them happen? Who's controlling the future of food? We'll talk about what we'd like to see happen some more shortly, but who's going to have the biggest influence? Is it governments? Is it business? Corinna, which you've referred to, seems to be having it its own way and causing us a lot of problems in our diet. You mentioned, Gordon, how important it is that everyone plays a role. But I suspect at the moment, a lot of individuals, a lot of citizens, consumers, if you like, feel pretty powerless. They are led by the market. We are often persuaded by powerful advertising to go down the route they want us to go. Who's in charge, and who should be in charge, and how can we change things? Gordon.
Well, I think you mentioned business, you mentioned society in general, you mentioned government. The answer is that all of those should be working together. I mean, to actually do what you want to do on a large scale, we need all of those actors, government, private sector, business, and so on, to work together. And we need to create that capacity by bringing these together. And there's no reason why we shouldn't. I mean, we need to think about all of this as a, if you like, as a war.
A war.
But a war in favour of a better diet.
Let me bring in one very specific issue in the world of food. You say war. I'd like to talk about food waste.
Right.
Because that seems to me to be a good example, an obvious area globally, we think of between 30 and 40% of all the food produced somewhere along the line is being wasted. Now, in some countries, particularly developing countries, this is often because of a lack of technology, a lack of refrigeration, infrastructure and transport systems. Food gets bruised and damaged and lost along the way of a not very efficient system. But in our own world, the wasting is happening at the back of the supermarkets, it's happening in our own fridges, in our bins at home. But the collective effect is the same wherever you are in the world. About a third of all our food gets wasted before we even get a chance to eat it. Who's doing wrong things in that story? How can we sort them out? And what can we do as individuals? And again, should government be stepping in? Corinna, perhaps for the big businesses who you've got your eyes on, should we be legislating to influence the way that our food companies and retailers produce waste? Should we be hitting them hard? Are voluntary codes of conduct enough? What are the actual tangible solutions to these problems?
Well, let me start by making an observation that I've made over many years, which is that nobody feels that they really have the power. So if you talk to a CEO of a major multinational company, if you talk to a consumer, if you talk to a small store owner, if you talk to somebody who is an entrepreneur, they'll think, I don't really have the power to change. It's somebody else. So there's a kind of a feeling that it's such a complex system that it's never quite my responsibility, it's always somebody else's fault. And I don't think that's intended necessarily, but I think it goes to show that the complexity of the system means that people don't necessarily feel that they are in control. And food waste is a great example of that, where you'll have the people who work for supermarkets saying, well, it's the consumers who are wasting food. And you'll have the people who are the farmers saying, well, it's the government's fault for setting this legislation about the use of certain pesticides, which means that I can't, I'm losing these crops, and so on. So when it comes to something like food waste, you need to be just very, very clear in all of these things and all of these solutions. What is it that you're trying to achieve here? And if the actual goal is we want to achieve food waste, we'd have to rebuild the system in a different way. And
this is what you've already said we need to do. So let's take the example of the cosmetic standards.
Yeah.
The very straight carrots and we all now, or some of us have now embraced the wonky carrot, which is great. But I know of at least some supermarkets that to produce the wonky carrots, they send somebody around the factory floor to pick up the wonky ones, and they get bagged up specially. But the almost perfect ones are still but not quite meeting the aesthetic standards, are still being kind of filtered out and wasted round the back. So there's a lot to answer for here, isn't there?
Exactly. So in that case, you need to have a combination of exposing young kids to wonky carrots. You need to have, so that they become acceptable, you need to have clear legislation that means that wonky carrots are just as acceptable as straight carrots, and to make sure that they're not filtered out of the system. You need to have supermarkets clearly regulated, so that they are not allowed to treat farmers in certain ways, which means that they then push wonky carrots out of the system. You need to take action at every single stage of the supply chain.
So we do need to take a tougher line with big business. We have to set minimum goals, minimum targets of minimum waste, and if they waste more than that minimum allowance of waste, they need to be penalised for it. I'm saying this because I think that's what we need to do. Do you agree that we do need to get tougher? I mean, so often there are voluntary codes, and the supermarkets say, we've all got together and we've said, we think we've got a lovely voluntary code here, but it's voluntary, and they actually all sort of conspire not to do, or to look like they're doing some of what's in the code, but it never quite happens. Does government need to get tough now? Penalise?
Government needs to get tough. But, I'm not anti-business. We need good, healthy food businesses. We need good businesses that work well. What we need to do is for government to get tough, because the good business will get innovative. Because good business is innovative. So if governments level the playing field and get tough, the good businesses will innovate, and they'll find a way to make money and to serve consumers just as well.
Okay, and the other thing perhaps that could be happening in the world of waste, of food waste is our behaviour at home. Because you said supermarkets blame the consumer and the consumer blame the supermarket, but actually we know that it's actually about 50-50, that of the 30%, about half of that is supply chain waste and back-of-store waste from the supermarket, and about half of it is us throwing away stuff that we haven't eaten at home. Supermarkets play a role in that too, because of their multi-packs and their irresistible offers. We're constantly trying to sell us just that little bit more food than we need. But do you think we have to shop a bit smarter too?
We have to value food. What's happened over the decades is that we have lost a value of food which has been created by a food system in which food is just plentiful and just comes out and we think it's just there and easy. You don't waste things you value, you don't throw away things that you value. And so as a society, as a global society, we need to rebuild that value in food, and we're not going to be able to do that if food is something that is just endless and bountiful and just coming from this planet, which can
unlimited choice,
unlimited.
365.
We actually need to get really tough on ourselves and say, you know what, we actually need to have less choice. That is so not a popular argument, but it is the reality that we could actually enjoy and nurture and feel closer to food if we actually had less choice. I think we've learned over the years, and many different disciplines have shown, that more choice is not necessarily a good thing for our identity, for our mental health, for the planet. We do need to have diversity. Diversity is a very, very good thing. But excessive choice...
Diversity as in we need to eat lots and lots of different types of food for our health, especially plants.
That is a good
Great diversity of plants.
Diversity throughout the whole food system is a very good thing. But that is different from providing...
From infinite choice of brands and
exactly.
seasonal foods flown in, or unseasonal foods flown. Gordon...
I was just going to go back to... I used the word war, and you were all a bit shocked about that. But I do think we actually need to get on a war footing against waste. It's not...
I agree.
And that's great. And so I think we have to really take this incredibly seriously now.
Are there lessons? You've done a lot of work in Africa, and I imagine that in many places in Africa, of course in parts of Africa, they produce food for the British supermarkets. Kenya grows beans, and there's a lot of wastage in that product as the beans get trimmed and flown or shipped over to Europe. But in many parts of Africa, the way in which we waste food in the West would be absolutely incomprehensible. For example, the grading out of imperfect fruit and vegetables would be completely beyond the comprehension of subsistence farmers in Africa. Tell me what you've learned and what are the failings in Africa. But Zimbabwe was once described as the breadbasket of Africa, and its agriculture has completely collapsed. Africa as a continent maybe has the potential to be the breadbasket of the world if we're going to continue to grow, if we're not going to go all the way down the lab-grown food route. What's happening in Africa and what can it tell us?
Well, first of all, we have in Africa right now 65 million people in southern Africa who are suffering from starvation. That's a serious issue. The other point to make is that Africa imports $40 billion worth of food a year. $40 billion worth of food into Africa. Much of it is already processed food. It's crazy. The whole thing is crazy. Now, there are ways of working to try and solve some of these problems in Africa. And that's one of the things that I've been spending a lot of my time on in the last decade or so. You can actually get the right kind of nutrients in the soil. You can get a hybrid maize, for example, and you can grow it with a particular mineral that's missing. For example, it may be all kinds of different, like boron or something like that that's missing. And a farmer in Africa with that set of ingredients can produce 4, 5, 6 tons of maize per hectare. And the average yield in Africa is under 1 ton per hectare. You just have to think about that you're a farmer and you've been given this hybrid maize to sow, and you've got the right kind of mixture of fertilizers and any special thing like boron that you need, and you wake up in the morning and you look at your field and you've got 5 or 6 tons where before you only had less than 1 ton. Now that happens now in Africa. There's lots of places, I've been to lots of small farms all over Africa where that happens. So the potential to do something in Africa is enormous.
Are those sort of crops you're talking about, they come under the genetically modified banner?
No, they're hybrids.
Right, but not GM?
No, they're not GM, they're hybrids.
So they're not necessarily owned and patented by the big corporations who then get a sort of stranglehold fix on the agriculture?
In some cases they are, but a lot of the hybrids that are produced in Africa now are produced by government laboratories. They're not produced by, and they're not patented. And you can buy the hybrid seed. You have to pay for it, usually, for a hybrid seed, but you don't have to pay much. And of course, if you're going from 1 ton to 6 tons, that's a hell of a return.
Yeah.
So that potential is there in Africa. And I've seen it all over Africa. But it's got to be magnified. You've got to have more investment to make sure that this all works better in the future.
And in so doing, I mean, can we address, and that's having the right crop for the right soil,
yes,
and that can increase productivity. How's that going to impact on other issues in the like soil erosion in the third world, the loss of the growing meat? And are there completely different solutions to that, or?
No, but you can. There's something called conservation farming. I don't want to bore you with it, but it's a very important activity in which you grow something like maize, right? And then when you've harvested the maize, you cut down the stalks of the maize, and it lies on the ground and rots into the soil. And then you also grow a legume, which of course fixes nitrogen.
A legume, a bean or a pulse.
A bean or something like that. Yeah. And so you've now got, that's what conservation farming is, those 3 things. Cutting the soil, cutting the stalks, letting them rot down into the ground, and then growing beans or peas or something like that. And then you get a really good yield, partly because of the nitrogen that comes from the legume, the peas or beans, but also because it is a system that regenerates the soil. So you've actually got an agricultural system that regenerates the soil. There are situations like that where there are win-wins. And there's many farmers in Africa trying to do that.
So are you hopeful about the way that continent is progressing with agriculture? Do you see green shoots, to use a...
Yes, I've recently written a book. I'm allowed to say this, aren't I?
You certainly are.
I've written a book called Food for All in Africa, and you can pick it up, not the book, but you can pick up the flyer on the way out. And basically, the book starts with the sentence, "This is an optimistic book." Because I am, even though when I spoke right at the beginning, I sounded pretty awful and dreadful and depressed and so on, and I do wake up sometimes like that. But other times when I'm out in the field with farmers, I get very excited about what they're able to do on their own. They can be very inventive, they can be very exciting, and you can see the way forward. And there are lots of examples of that in Africa, which give you a great deal of hope.
So we're talking about, I'd like to bring you in here, because Gordon's talking about some amazing potential improvements in versions of conventional farming, growing agricultural crops. Yeah. At this moment, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about exactly what you do. And have you brought that little jar with you? Do you have it in your pocket?
Yeah, I have. So I could maybe still a bit continue. So basically what you are meaning with conservation farming, so then you actually increase the kind of soil microorganisms, so kind of build up the soil microbes.
Yes.
So actually what we have, so our process, so this is actually also one of the soil microorganisms. So
you're in a strange kind of way, your product, a little of which is in this jar. Don't worry, it doesn't glow in the dark, and it won't. If he opens the top, we won't all get radioactive or have limbs falling off. We hope. But what you've got in that jar, also in a strange way, starts with the soil. Can you just summarize in layman's terms, because this could be the future? What have you got in that jar, and how important could it be?
Yeah, so in essence what we do, we have discovered an organism in essence from soil samples, so that it's a natural kind of in that microbial population of soil. So we have screened an organism in such conditions, so this grows in very minimal requirements, and we can grow this organism in a bioreactor, a bit similar to growing like lactic acid bacteria for yogurt or making beer.
In a bioreactor.
So in a bioreactor fermenter, so big steel tanks. But we don't need any agricultural products to grow this. So we just need electricity, which is the energy source, and CO2, and then some minerals and water.
Electricity, minerals from the soil, trace amounts, not huge quantities.
No, I mean, it's not actually soil. It's basically the similar as fertilizers. So
microbes.
Yeah, fertilizers. So kind of minerals like calcium, potassium, iron.
And you're fermenting them in a reactor?
Yes, so in essence what we are doing is that we just let the organism fulfill its purpose, so to grow.
It sounds to me like you're saying you're making this powder, and we'll get into what's in the powder and why it might be a food in a minute, but you sound like you're saying you're making it out of thin air, or thin air and water.
In essence, yes. So from air we get the 4 most important chemical elements that are in our bodies. So 95% of us is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen and nitrogen, and these all chemical elements we can get from air. So in essence the air is the major component.
So I know that other fermented foods that have been used in an industrial way, corn is quite a familiar product to some. It's been around for quite a while. That's based on a fermentation process. It's a sort of fungusy thing, isn't it? That then gets sort of creamed off the top of the vat and pressed and formed in various ways. But corn is fed on other plant materials, carbohydrates or sugar of some kind. You're not putting anything in that's no grown matter, no plant material goes in?
No, nothing.
But food comes out? Who thinks this sounds a bit almost like, I don't know, perpetual motion or close to impossible?
No, it's not.
But Gordon's going to back you up here. This is real. We're not. This is not any sort of a hoax here. This is real. Tell me then, what are the food properties? In what way does what you have in that jar resemble food as we understand it? How could it be used as a food?
So this has about 65% protein, and amino acid composition is quite similar to soy, for instance, so that it has all the essential amino acids that we as humans require in our diet. And then it has some like 10% carbohydrates and about 5% fatty acids. But basically this is just the organism that is grown and dried.
So it's high protein, it's got 10% carbs and some fatty acids, what you would describe as essential fatty acids, the good ones?
Well, yeah. The normal ones.
The normal ones. And so where might it end up in the I mean, going forward to the 5 or 10 years where you think it could be playing a really significant role, how might we be consuming it?
Yeah, so this can be then ingredient in various food products. So we could make a kind of a burger-like patty using this as an ingredient instead of soy, for instance. So then we can kind of replace the soy as an ingredient with this one. And also going further, we could use the amino acids from here as an ingredient for growing lab meat in bioreactors. Right, so this kind of meat cells in the bioreactor.
So this is not lab meat, this is lab high-protein
these are not
powder
meat
that can
cells,
be...
no.
It's more of a soy powder substitute than a meat substitute. But, of course, soy powder can be used to make things like this, and I actually tried, for the first time yesterday, a Beyond Burger and a Naked Glory. Very strange name. But so these are the latest. These are not lab-grown meats, but they are the latest versions of vegetable-based, very designed to very, very closely resemble meat. And you could have something there that would give these guys a run for their money, but would need no plants at all.
Yes, that's correct. So kind of make something that resembles meat, or then just as an ingredient in normal food products like
And then
bread
in a
or...
parallel world of lab-grown foods, people are also cultivating or starting to cultivate real meat cells from animals, but grown without animals. That's the potential future of lab meat. So what you're doing there and what they're doing there could add up to a significant contributor.
Yes, so this has similar
I want to get two reactions from our other panelists. This, Gordon, are you broadly in favour of
Yes,
this?
no, I'm very excited about this. I don't know how many of you read George Monbiot's piece in The Guardian.
Yes, or indeed saw the Channel 4 documentary he made called Apocalypse Cow. Hands up if you saw that. Quite a lot of you.
Quite a lot of you. That's good. I mean, I'm not a great fan of George Monbiot normally. But
I am, George, if you're watching online. I love you to bits. Great show.
I think his article and what he's arguing for is extraordinary and extremely exciting. I mean, there is here now a potential that you could produce all the food that we need in the world. There's only just one exception, and that is fruits and vegetables.
But hang on, because I'm telling everyone that we should be eating about 70% fruit and vegetables if we're going to have a healthy diet.
Well, that's fine.
That's quite a big missing chunk. But I could see that 30% is still a significant...
We will still have farms producing fruit and vegetables, but for the rest of the food that we need, it can be done through this process. I mean, we could end up with a world where, for example, in the United Kingdom, we've got fruit and vegetable gardens down in the southeast. We might also still continue to grow vines for grapes, because in the southeast where I live, that's basically what we do all the time, is we drink an awful lot of what we call champagne, because the climate's great. But otherwise, the rest of the United Kingdom eventually could be there for all kinds of conservation regions. It could be wilded. We could wild the United Kingdom, apart from the fruit and vegetables. And eventually we could wild the world, apart from fruit and vegetables. The potential is there to do that.
So this is starting to sound exciting, and George gets very excited about this in the programme, and paints a picture of a world where, because land is... far less land is needed to produce the food that we all need. Land can be returned to a pristine state, and we can repopulate amazing biodiversity. And in a very romantic way, in the UK, we could have wolves and lynx and even bears and great wild stretches. Yet we could all have access to that. It could be part of our free time, could be to explore these places and go on an amazing safari of our own a beautiful natural world restored.
That's all very romantic, but I like it. But the really important point here is that instead of cutting down even more forest to grow soybean
to feed to animals,
the Chinese
and animals,
which is what's going on at the moment, we can stop that. We can stop the cutting of the forest in the Amazon. We can stop the cutting of the forest. I spent the first 6 years of my life living in Borneo, and I lived in the forest. It was the most wonderful place in the world. I used to wake up in the morning and the gibbons would fly over. They wouldn't fly, but they'd leap. They seemed as though they were flying. They'd leap from tree to... And they would chirp. They'd sing to me as I was sat there at the bottom of the trees. That's a world that we can get back if we devote our energies to producing the kind of food that you are talking about.
Well, I'd like to ask Corinna what she thinks of this extraordinary world that might be just a couple of decades away. And in particular, are you concerned that the kind of high-tech foods that don't involve land at all might not be all that we need physically for healthy eating. Do you think they may end up? Is there a kind of Murphy's Law about this that, you know, Frankenstein foods? I don't want to. But the high tech that foods that are essentially not. Well, they won't. One thing we can say is they won't be the actual foods that we evolved to eat over millennia. They may be very close to them in ways that our bodies might be okay about, but maybe our bodies might not be okay. Are you concerned, Corinna?
Yeah, I'm deeply unexcited by by these technical solutions, I have to say. And the reason, there's lots of reasons, but I'll just give a couple. And the first reason is that nutritional science is still a young science. And there's a lot we don't know about. We know basically what a healthy diet is. We basically know what we need to develop and grow and be healthy, and children need. But there's a lot we don't understand about how those healthy foods actually play out in our bodies. We barely really, we kind of know what a calorie is, but our science even is evolving on that. And so to then think that we can say, okay, we can mimic the most wholesome parts of human nutrition into something which is grown in a lab or is artificially created, is to ignore that we don't know enough about nutritional science, and that we need to have, and we do know what is working for us, which is lots of fruits and vegetables, whole grain, modest amounts of fish, modest amounts of dairy, and a small amount of meat, and plenty of nuts and seeds. We know that works well for health. Why are we saying we know what the good things are, we've got to go and find something else? Well, the argument is because it's impacting the planet. We can reduce food waste by 30% and loss. So why don't we start with food waste? Why don't we start by saying...
Well, if we're going to have to do all that, if we're going to have to wait 10 or 20 years for significant contributions, we're going to have to be doing that anyway.
And there's a lot of political and economic and social problems around food which won't be solved by technical solutions. When we think that 75% of young children in low middle income countries do not have sufficient dietary diversity, and a lot of them are because they are on a low socioeconomic, they're poor. When we think about 30% of children in this country experiencing overweight and obesity with a disproportionate amount in deprivation, the economics and the deprivation aspects of food will not go away just because we've got technical solutions. So we have to think of this as a political and economic problem as well as a technical and environmental problem. There's a lot that can be done, that we can do, and we can have lab-grown meats. But we shouldn't see them.
So you're not rejecting them?
I'm not rejecting them. I'm deeply unexcited them as a totalising solution. I'm saying if it's seen as the solution is this, that's dangerous. If we see the solution is there's a whole diversity of solutions and lab-grown meat can be part of that, that's fine, but it shouldn't suck all the money out.
Have we got enough... I mean, you might want to come on this, or you might want to address this specific question. Is there enough land on the planet to grow enough food, even if it's more leaning towards veg, to feed close to 8 million people and rising, or do we need a significant amount of that food to not put a burden on the land in the future? I mean, you've got to call it, haven't you?
I think we can grow enough to feed everyone at this point if we grow differently. And if we reduce meat.
And if we eat differently.
We have to reduce meat. I mean, I don't think there's any question that we have to reduce meat. But we can reduce meat, and we can actually eat less meat. And many people should eat less meat. But of course, there's always going to be some meat, and that's fine. So lab-grown meat can help with some of that meat reduction. But there's a lot more we can do to produce food differently, which can be good for the planet as well as our health.
You've introduced this exciting idea, and we've got very agitated about it, in both enthusiastic but also a little bit scared. Just come back to us. How do you see the role that your type of food is going to play? What will the relationship be with land-grown foods? in the longer term.
I also see the future as kind of that there will be diverse options available. And I also think that in the end, of course, the consumers will make the decisions. So that, I mean, I've been thinking as an engineer, so that there are kind of 5 criteria based on which we make the decisions. So, I mean, it's of course the taste, it must taste good, otherwise it stays in the shop. And then there's the price, so that can we afford this? And then there's the convenience, so that the kind of fast food versus that you kill a pig and slaughter a pig and then make your meat out of that. So how easy it is to make. And then of course is the health aspects. And then the kind of the last arrival is the sustainability of this food.
Can you make fiber? Can you make cellular? I mean, is there any fiber in that? We know, one thing we know we're missing in a lot of our food, or most people are simply not getting enough plant-based fiber. Can you make a version of plant-based fiber that will be as welcomed by our intestines in helping our gut bacteria develop healthily?
Yeah, it has some fiber, but I guess the main input from this kind of is the protein, so that it's high in protein. So, of course, we need to have, when we have a kind of wholesome diet, we will have to have more carbohydrates and fatty acids. So this has kind of too much protein to be eaten as such.
Okay, so to give us some idea, you've given us a time scale anyway, but I'd just like to know, you've mentioned cost, that's absolutely crucial. Do you mind if can you give us how much is the little bit of powder in that glass? How much does it cost you to make that? Come on, serious now.
So it's...
I mean, I'm not saying it's going to have a massive value on the open market or on the street, as it were, but I'm really keen to know how much it's costing right now.
So, of course, different ways to calculate, but let's say about 20,000.
Wow. I just need to be really clear. You will not get 20,000 quid for what's in that, wherever you take it. But you're saying that's roughly what the price you would put on that at the moment.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to bring that down by, well, probably by about 100,000 times, aren't you? I mean, and until you can get that to cost about 20p or less, it's not going to have a massive impact.
Yeah. So the idea is, I mean, we have that in the larger scale, in 5 years' time, we could be cost competitive with other protein ingredients, so like pea protein, not necessarily with soy protein, but so it could be in the 3 to 6 euro per kilo of protein range. So then it could
60
be
euro per kilo?
6
euros per kilo
of protein.
For the protein gives, and then you're in business.
Yeah.
But we know with new technologies they get cheaper and cheaper.
Yeah, no, I totally get that.
This is a law.
Yeah. It's the mobile phone that went from being like that, and
that's right.
only ridiculously rich people in the city had them, and now we've...
The other thing I just want to add in here is, it's true that we don't really know very well what a healthy food is or a healthy diet is. We know pretty well what it is, but we don't know enough about what it is. What we do know is what an unhealthy food and an unhealthy diet is. And we know that, as I said earlier, and I want to repeat it, the National Health Service in this country is collapsing under the weight of illnesses caused by people eating the wrong diet. By people eating the wrong diet, becoming obese, getting cardiovascular diseases, getting all kinds of illnesses. The National Health Service
But we also know, as Corinna has made, that the immediate available solution to that, available actually in every supermarket, is more fruit and veg. We know that really does solve that problem, and that's not what's in that jar.
But a lot of it is about price.
Sure.
You know, there's this company called McDonald's. You've heard about it?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And you can go into McDonald's now. I don't know what in Newcastle it costs, but a hamburger is $1, a pound something. Just about a pound or something like that, isn't it? Just over.
It's just under a pound maybe for a burger, but a bit
I
more
guess
for a
nobody in this audience has eaten a McDonald's.
quarter pounder.
That's what it is. You're all innocents in here, aren't you? That's why you've come. But if it's only a pound or something,
it's a hell of a lot more expensive to eat high-quality fruit and vegetables and other foods. And we've got to deal with that issue too. Otherwise, people will go on eating junk food.
It's a sort of circular issue because one of the reasons, we are wasting a lot of fruit and vegetables that they could be cheaper.
Yes.
The supermarkets could, but healthy foods are not massively more expensive if you can cook. If you can buy raw ingredients and you know what to do with them, you can actually eat very well, very healthily on a budget. And for me, that puts us back to the issue of education and skilling people up from a very young age to be it's incredible resilience you get if you learn how to cook. Whatever else life throws at you, if you actually have some reasonable cooking skills, you can actually cook your way out of trouble and you can cook your way into reasonable health.
There are many schools.
But we need education to sort that out.
And there are many schools that do produce, that's right, do produce good diets for their school children, that's right.
It's improving, and when I was last here in Newcastle, we looked at some fantastic schools which are feeding their kids here really well. But those same kids on their way home from school are inevitably walking past junk food outlets and even corner shops that sell crazy high-energy drinks full of sugar and caffeine and highly saturated snacks, which are made very, very tempting and advertised very, very hard. So that's the sort of problem, Corinna. I mean, we need to address that, don't we? We do have to address the cultural food problem, and because we need to be healthy. If we're going to solve the planetary food crisis, we've got to solve the human health food crisis.
We've got to solve the human health crisis. When diet is the largest cause of ill health globally, we've got to take the spotlight off those unhealthy foods and put the spotlight onto the healthy and nutritious foods. It's as you know from your own experiences here and elsewhere, it's a challenge, and it is a challenge associated with socioeconomic deprivation and inequality. And I hesitate in saying that because it's a problem amongst everybody. As well, with disproportionate concern that it's almost like it comes across as people are stupid and so on. But when you look very, very closely, as I have done over the years, at why people eat what they do, and we do know what a healthy diet is, what we don't know is the science of exactly what makes it healthy. But we do know broadly what a healthy diet is that what influences what people eat, what influences everybody, and what we all eat in this room, myself, is a whole range of different things. And it comes to do with how we emotionally relate with food. It becomes to do with our identity around food. It becomes to do with our knowledge. It becomes something to do with how much money we've got as well. But it's a confluence of all of these things. So, for example, if you are walking home and if you want to actually have some time with your kids at home, you don't have a dining table, you don't really have anywhere to cook, it's logical to go and buy an unhealthy takeaway. It's logical, if you want to have some positive time with your family, to take them for a treat to McDonald's. It's actually a positive and sensible thing to do for the social life of your family. So we can't just see it as it's just price or it's just this or it's just that.
Complicated.
The reason why it's so exciting, isn't it, as a challenge, is because it's genuinely complicated. And that's why we have to start by understanding the realities of people's lives, about why they're making the choices they do, and to start thinking of food as a wonderful, positive thing that can bring communities together, that can help people's mental health, help their physical health, and make people feel good about themselves, and actually put a halo around food and healthy food, and make people get excited, help people get excited about it, put the spotlight on it, and just make it into such a positive force in people's lives. Because at the moment, the unhealthy food is the positive force, not the healthy food. And we need to move that around.
We have to rise to the challenge of making healthy choices easier, and that means making them more delicious. And that's something I've tried to do, and will continue to try to do, because like you, I think that's really important. You mentioned community there, and you mentioned local at the beginning, and I want to talk about, we know we face a massive global problem, but we all have to make our daily choices at a local level. And I've made television programs and written books and talked enthusiastically about the power of going local, and even if you possibly can, growing a little bit of your own food, maybe in an allotment, or even on a window box, growing a few herbs. That there's something about that you connect with your ingredients. Now, Now, is that just a romantic notion? And is the rose-tinted vision of bucolic existence where people actually go out and do a bit of foraging for wild foods? Nobody's ever more than a stroll away from a blackberry bush. And these have the ability to give us a little bit of free food, but maybe not significant calories. But they have the ability to make us connect with food and plants at a local level. I'd love to know, Gordon, whether you think this has real meaning or whether it's just a fantasy peddled on television by the likes of that ridiculous guy who used to have long hair and forage a lot.
Me?
No, me.
Oh, you.
Is the idea of local food? Is the idea of local food and growing your own a romantic notion?
No. I grow all our own blackberries. I grow all our own gooseberries. I grow lots of apples. I make enough apple juice to last a whole year.
But that's lovely because you've got a nice garden and the space to do it. But is that meaningful in a global sense?
There's other problems, though. You try growing any kind of cabbage, and what you do is you grow cabbage white butterflies.
Yes, I know the feeling.
It is. It's a dreadful problem. And I don't know what on earth you do about it. Maybe some of you can tell me.
Well, I pick them off. I pick the caterpillars off. Off the cat. That's the only. I mean, you can use horrible chemical sprays, which I prefer not to do, but you have to pick the caterpillars off and then deal with them humanely. And so, one way to do.
I'm not going to deal with caterpillars humanely.
I put them in the freezer. Slugs too. It seems to me to be, and then I defrost them and feed them to the chickens. Anyway, that's just me.
But you can do, even in a small garden, even in a small allotment. There are lots of allotments around in this country.
Do they make a significant contribution to food? And should they? Is local... I mean, there are cities in the world, for example, Havana in Cuba, where urban veg growing is contributing really significantly to the all-important fruit and veg local consumption of the people who live in that city.
I don't think you necessarily make a big impact on food production. What you do is you acclimatise people to the virtues of growing food and what food does and so on and so forth. If you
connect people.
Food, yes, it's part of the contribution towards having better diets. It doesn't in itself create that.
Do you grow your own fruit and veg?
No.
You don't?
I mean, but it actually could help also if you grow your food and vegetable yourself, so then you appreciate the food more and then maybe waste food less. So. That's right. That's maybe also...
So as an emotional connection with food and a sense, and in order to nurture a sense of responsibility for food and not wasting it, that it's a precious thing, growing your own, or perhaps buying your food from the people who grow it at a local level helps make that...
Let me come in here, because I think you have, as an individual, famously so, I have, less famously so, our own identities around food. And our own feelings about connecting with food. Other people have different feelings around food, and I think it's our responsibility, and not necessarily to preach our own beliefs to others, but to try and understand and empathise with how they relate to food, so that we get into other people's heads to say, this is how they understand food. How can that be levered into a more positive relationship with healthy food? I'll never forget, if you'll forgive me for just saying a very brief story, walking around a township in South Africa a few years ago and taking this marvellous photo of these two women with huge smiles on their faces who were selling the fattiest meat you've ever seen at the side of this township street. Because it's safe, fruits and vegetables, they worry about them being unsafe and they can't fry them and so on. And then they were selling their Coca-Cola and so on behind them. And that community has lots and lots of diet-related ill health, stunting, all kinds of problems. But their relationship with food was an economic relationship, that they were making money out of selling this horrendously fatty meat and Coca-Cola. And that was important to them as speaking to them. How are you going to that's when what your notion becomes very romantic. There isn't anywhere to grow food where they are. There isn't even a little plot anywhere. And so I think, okay, how do you then move that community towards eating more fruits and vegetables and connecting with food in a different way? So in other words, each community is going to do it differently. You just need to be very purposeful about it. I think if we get too romantic about our own connection with food, I like you, I love growing food and all of those kinds of things, that it does become unrealistic and people push it aside. It's about trying to understand where other people are coming from and being empathetic and working with that.
Thank you very much. I've been a bit remiss, and I think it's really important for me to say at this point that we're fantastically grateful for all the audience questions, and I should have said after the introductory remarks and a couple of my own questions, I did move into your questions, and I have been asked, so one of your questions was, how can we create a sustainable food system based on a local model, and is it scalable? So that was what we were just talking about then. I want to get back to the subject of meat, because this is another audience question. And it comes up all the time, and there's a lot of focus on it. So I just want you, let's head on, I want each of you to concisely give me your view on what role does veganism have in feeding the world and sustainably managing the land? Is it quite important that significant numbers of us shun actual meat from animals altogether and forever? Not vegetarianism, but veganism. It's growing. Does it have to keep growing if we're going to get where we need to get? Gordon?
Well, I'm very much in favour of more vegetarianism. I'm a bit worried about veganism. I remember one of the dentists along the road from where I lived, he had a child who'd been brought up completely from the beginning as a vegan, and all his teeth had dropped out. I mean, it was really difficult. Now that's an anecdote, and it's not scientific.
Okay, and
I've heard enough of those there.
Yeah,
Veganism
I want to pull you up on that,
because you get to a certain age, but up to a certain age there are difficulties, as I understand.
There can be difficulties with a vegan diet, but I think that the science is pretty much in that the right vegan diet can be perfectly healthy, as long as you're. And the key thing is it's omega-3s, seeds and nuts. It's true that there are some very unhealthy vegan diets out there, and if you miss out on the seeds and the pulses and the proteins and the benefits from
that's a qualification, and we need to be clear about that.
Absolutely. But, I mean, meat, how much is meat the problem, and how much do we... I mean, is it pretty much inevitable? Are we heading towards a future, at some point on the timescale of decades that you has introduced to us today, when eating meat will basically be seen as an affront to the planet, perhaps an ethical and sustainability problem, that it will be unacceptable to eat meat? Do you think we're heading in that direction, Hugh? Inevitably, however far away it might be, that's where we're going to get to.
Well, maybe, I mean, a little bit of meat in the future might be still possible, but I think in the heart of veganism is milk and egg. So, of course, I mean, milk comes from cows, and then when you have...
Not at the heart of veganism, at the heart of vegetarian diet, but of course vegans don't eat milk and eggs.
Yeah. So that when you...
But
I mean, vegetarian diet would be... I mean, where I'm getting to is that with vegetarian diet in itself, it would be nice so that you still have milk, and from milk you get, for instance, B12 vitamin, and in that way. But still to get kind of... to avoid milk, so then you also have to kind of get rid of the cows.
Well, you won't have a lot of farm animals around if we have an almost entirely vegan food system, but maybe we will, in the version of the vision that George Monbiot's film presents and that we've discussed here this evening, maybe we will have a very stunning planet where we can engage with the natural world, and species that we know right now as being on the brink of collapse are abundant and thriving again. And I'd like to, before we come to your set of sort of closing thoughts on this, I'd like to turn to the audience, and it's not hugely easy to see a show of hands, but I'm sure we can, and I will, for the benefit of those following us online, I will try and tell you what sort of hands I see going up. Who feels in the room here today that they would be prepared to make quite radical sacrifices in their diet, perhaps in the direction of eating very little or almost no meat, and embracing future lab-grown foods, even if they are unfamiliar and less immediately appealing than the foods you know and love right now? Who's prepared to do those things? Who thinks that's the physical and emotional sacrifices that involves are worth it if we really do see extraordinary restoration of the biodiversity and indeed the climate and the things that we know are absolutely on the slide? Hands up if you're ready to make that sacrifice. That's quite a lot of hands going up, but in order to work, I need to see how many hands are not going up. Could you show me, if you think that's too much to ask, there's more of you than that, because come on, or it's just not realistic, or you like the idea in principle, but actually you know that when it comes to it, it probably won't happen. Well, on that basis, I think a few of you didn't put your hands up at all, but I think we probably had 2/3 who said they would be prepared to make those radical changes, and a third who said that felt like it was probably a bit too much. Are you heartened by that, Gordon? Do you think that
yes.
shows that we're ready for
Yes.
massive changes?
Yes, I think we can make radical changes. We have to make them, but I think we also can do it. And I think what we need to do is to move fast. And I know you're talking about a couple of decades. I think we need some priorities here. I would like to see the first priority be to produce the kinds of foods based on soil microorganisms that you've been producing as a means of reducing meat production and consumption. I think if we can make a big impact on that right from the early stage, not in 2 decades, but in less than a decade, get on with it. Let's do it.
So do we then accept, everybody, be quite brief, do we then accept that in this world where a lot less of our land food is going to feed animals for meat, that we will need something that looks and tastes very like meat, but is not from animals? Is that going to be, does that need to be part of it?
Yeah.
Because I have to say, for me personally, I don't think it does. Because, I would certainly where that world of fake meat or these kind of imitation meat products are now, they have very little appeal to me. I'd much rather have a good veggie, old school veggie burger with beans and bits of identifiable bits of vegetables squished together in a nice tasty burger than something that looks a little bit like meat, smells a little bit odd, and has quite a weird sensation in your mouth when you eat it. But that is indeed just me. But what do you think? That we will need something that is very, very like meat, looks, smells, and tastes as close as we can get, but isn't from an animal. Is that an essential part of the solution?
Well, I think that we will get used to. I mean, as long as it's
tasty. But do you think it's an essential part of the solution? It's an inevitable one, that we'll need non-animal meat, whether it's brilliantly made from your sort of materials or grown from actual meat cells but without the animals themselves. Is it vital?
I think it's important, yes.
Corinna?
I don't think it's vital. And I worry that even though it could be a solution of sorts, that it will come onto the marketplace and it'll be purchased by certain groups of people, but it won't actually replace or lead to meaningful meat reduction. And it will just be the health engaged or the planetary engaged who begin to reduce their meat, rather than what we need to do is really a much more significant thing than that.
I side with you emotionally, but I also wonder whether such are the extraordinary ways of progress in science that actually we may be on the way to not only seeing meat replaced by lab-grown foods, but actually further down the line, what seems to now to be impossible, to make an apple. Do you think we can ever make an apple? Or you think that's never going to happen?
No.
Good.
You're taking it to an extreme here.
Okay. But we don't need to take it to
there's
that
an
extreme.
urgency that we have. This
Okay.
is the most important thing. We're around the world, we're cutting down forest, right, left and centre.
And it's
all
for meat.
across Africa, all across Southeast Asia, all across Latin America. We're just cutting down huge amounts of forest, destroying all this
To feed livestock.
to feed livestock.
So the quicker we can get to the meat that isn't from animals, the
better.
the quicker we can solve that
Absolutely.
problem. Okay, I've
Because
got it.
otherwise,
And I think
we've had it.
yeah, okay, it's that bad. That's got to be part of the solution.
I think so. I mean,
Okay, we've just got a few minutes. I mean, I think we're 2-1 on that. I'm currently divided. Emotionally, I'm with you, but I think probably that is where we're headed. We've got just a few minutes left, and I'd like to give you all a chance to share with us some thoughts on what you personally are doing and planning to do, your bit, as you like, in a way that maybe others can follow, to address this issue of the impact of our eating on our planet. Corinna, what changes have you made or are you making that others might be able to adopt to make the planet a better place, food-wise?
The most important thing is investing time in helping my 12-year-old daughter. I think we all have a responsibility to the next generation. And any mother in the audience will know how hard it is. Indeed, fathers will
Dads
know.
too?
Dads too, sorry. Will know how hard it is to encourage young children to eat well and to enable them to eat a diverse diet, which means they don't always be wanting that either the sugary food or the meat or whatever. And so I think that's something that I am personally very invested in.
I'm going to stop you there because I want to get everybody in. But I think that raising a generation that understands what good food is and that it needs to be plant-based.
Yeah.
Gordon, what are you doing at home, in the kitchen, in the garden, that we can all do that's going to make a difference?
Well, what we were talking about earlier, I think we do need to produce as much food, vegetarian food, that we can eat ourselves, maybe some chickens and eggs and things in our own gardens or in our allotments or whatever it is. I think that's important. But I don't think that's the solution to the problem. The solution to the problem is literally to try and reduce the amount of meat production.
But so I'm asking you what you would do. So I have to really interpret that as you're saying, when it's there, products like this, you're ready to switch from real meat to fake meat to do your bit, and we should do likewise.
Yes, absolutely.
Got you.
He's my hero.
Great. I totally get it. Ewa, what about you? What are you doing in your own life to make a difference?
Yeah, well, I'm still a meat eater, but certainly I have reduced, and I'm reducing amount of meat. But I think as humans we will adapt. I mean, hunter-gatherers, they didn't have hamburgers. So in the future, next generation or kind of further generations don't necessarily need to know even about hamburgers.
No more hamburgers. You're going to get to a zero hamburger.
well,
because you and your collaborators and maybe your competitors are going to solve that problem. That's going to be your commitment to go meat-free.
Yeah.
Okay, I feel I need to ask myself the same question, and I have to say I don't feel that I'm ready to go meat-free, and I feel a bit of a hypocrite that we've got to this point in the discussion, and I know that I'm not going vegan tomorrow. I have reduced the meat I eat a lot, and I consider it a very, very precious food, and I try not to squander it. And I'm going to side with Corinna, and I think education is the key, and I want children who understand cooking and understand what real food is. And I would be fine if they didn't make a switch to the meat that isn't meat, but I would like to think that they led the way with food that's made from plants, which is, I think, in the immediate future, that we all need to put at the front of what we're doing. It's been wonderful talking with you all. Thank you for coming here and listening to this. We've been around a very hard subject, and I think we've covered a lot of interesting areas. I think we've concluded that we are going to see radical change, but that we are individually going to have very different paths in how we deal with it and how we address it and whether or not we embrace it. But there are obviously, as we've also discussed, multiple ways to do it, to engage, to be part of the solution. And I hope that you here in Sage Gateshead tonight, and those of you following the live stream, will be able to take something out of the evening and say, yeah, I can do that. I think that's the way to go. But that at all times, you stay engaged with this critical issue and are ready to be part of the solution in whatever way you conclude is the best way to go. So on that thought, I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring our conversation to a close. Remember that this is the third event in a whole series that will be touring the UK over the coming months, all of which can be watched live, like some of you have tonight, and will be available later to watch on the Royal Society's YouTube channel. The very next event will be at the Eden Project in Cornwall on Wednesday, the 26th of February, and it will be exploring the topic, which we have touched on quite a lot tonight, of biodiversity. So please look out for that one. If you want to find out more about the series, please visit royalsociety.org, stroke you and the planet. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us tonight, here in Gateshead and online. Thank you, Corinna. Thank you, Juha, and thank you, Gordon. Please, everyone, give a round of applause to our fantastic panelists. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to wander off.